Hello, and welcome to Superstar Student Lecture 11 and 12. This is a lecture series specifically for students in the first 10 lectures. However, now at lectures 11 and 12, I turn for a few minutes and speak with parents and grandparents maybe about academic success for sons, daughters, grandchildren. I want to point out here before we even begin that more than providing a tremendous amount of answers, what we're really doing is making sure that we are all aware of the primary questions we want to ask. Because once we know what the questions are, we can begin to try to find answers for those questions. In Lecture 11, I want to speak specifically about high school success and what a parent can do to promote success for their son or daughter while in high school. In the final lecture, Lecture 12, I want to talk about choices that have to be made after high school. Far too often, I fear, as I speak with parents, they wait until the junior or the senior year of high school to really begin to ask these kinds of focused or pointed questions. And we want to maybe ask them a little earlier than that. For this lecture, we're going to talk primarily about three things. We want to speak, first of all, about what I call the language of learning. In other words, when a parent sits down with their son or daughter and speaks with them about school, how should they talk about school? Then we want to talk about important issues of motivation. Far too often parents ask me, what do you do when your son or your daughter just doesn't seem to care about school at all? And finally, thirdly, we want to talk about important keys of academic success for high school students. If I am a parent and I want to make sure that my son or daughter is a success, what are the primary issues for me early on that I need to consider? Now there are, I know, many parents who will be watching this video who maybe don't even have yet children in high school, and that's outstanding, because the sooner we can begin to consider these questions, the better. Let's talk for a few minutes about academic language. Because the key to academic success, I believe, is the ability to communicate well within the family. I believe that the family has to be seen as a team which dreams of academic success together. But think about how often you have spoken maybe to your son or daughter about school. Your young son or daughter comes in from their sophomore year of high school at the end of a day, runs through the kitchen on their way somewhere, and we say to them, "Hi, honey, did your day go okay? Did you do all right in school?" Well, now the reality is, if the student is struggling in school, rarely is a student going to say, "You know, Mom, I really am struggling. Can we sit down and talk about my problems in school?" What is it most poor students say to their parents? "Oh, great. Everything's going great, Mom. Can I borrow the keys and be gone?" And of course, the reality is for many parents, they don't realize that really their son or daughter is having academic problems until maybe a grade report comes home, or a parent calls and says, "Your son hasn't handed in homework for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Now we've got problems." And then typically after that, what is the way a parent speaks to the son or daughter? We sit down across the table in that somewhat scary meeting for kids, and we say, "All right, you better get on it. What's going on here?" And unfortunately, often, the son or daughter doesn't have any way to respond intelligently. And so then it ends up a fight. "Leave me alone. Go away. I don't want to talk with you. It's none of your business. You never know what it's like to be a kid. We're in the 90s and it's different," and on and on and on. And I think that for many of us, then frustration grows. I believe that each of us has to understand what role we play on the academic team, as I'll call it. Each player has to have a common language so that we can talk about learning success. I believe that one of the best places for this is the ideas that I present on Superstar Student in the first few lectures. If you haven't already done so, I would strongly recommend that you go back and watch, either with your son or daughter or alone, the first, for sure, lecture of Superstar Student. There I define learning, and I place learning within a context. If you have what I call code language, you can begin to seriously talk with your son or daughter immediately about academic weaknesses and strategies to somehow correct those weaknesses. I define learning as the ability to connect new things to old things, and the ability to be what I call a warrior and a scholar, to admit that one has academic weaknesses, and then to try and find ways to solve those academic weaknesses. If you are capable of talking with your son or daughter about these things in code language, then you can begin immediately to address what are obvious problems. More important than grades is student learning. Far too often, parents will use grades as a measure of academic success, and we know too many stories of students who graduate from high school with all of the accolades. They are the top basketball players. They are the top students in terms of grades, only to go on to university and struggle and sometimes even drop out of school. That is how, in fact, I began Superstar Student Lecture 1, with a real-life story, name is changed of the student, of a young man and his parents who sat across the table from me, and Mom and Dad were stunned, shell-shocked. How could a student who did so well in high school leave and go to a state university only 9 weeks later to determine that he will no longer be in university? How do we respond? Grades are not the way we measure academic success. When a parent and a student sits down then and talks together about studies, there has to be an understanding of what I believe two things of importance: the role the parent must play and the role the student must play. And if we haven't talked about these in advance, we're going to begin to butt heads right away. The parent needs to understand that their role is academic leader on the team. It's his or her job to keep the student focused on the big picture, to make sure that post-high school and a well-lived life is what we talk about in our house regularly. It's the job of the parent then, I guess is what I'm saying here, to serve as kind of the coach, to remind the player, the student, that this is the big deal here. We really have a game coming. Sometimes that game is defined as getting up every morning and going to school. Sometimes the game is the selection of maybe a college down the line. I'll talk about that in the next lecture. The student's role has to be understood as well, and I spent several lectures in Superstar Student Lectures 1 through 7 and even 8, talking about what that role is in terms of personal responsibility. The bottom line is that the student must take responsibility for his or her learning. Too often parents try to do it for the son or daughter. I am familiar, for example, with mothers who will write their papers for their sons or daughters because their sons or daughters are too busy and are out on a sporting outing. The reality here is your son, your daughter has to do the academic work. We don't want to cripple our children by allowing them to believe that we will always be there for them later in life when the going gets tough to do it for them. The way I like to talk about the relationship or the interplay between the role of parent and student is in a story that I used in the first lecture of Superstar Student, How to Ride a Bike. When we taught, if we taught, our son or daughter how to ride a bike, we had to help them overcome a tremendous amount of fear because they were afraid they were going to fall and feel pain. Nothing has changed as they enter high school and begin to consider their possible university experiences afterwards. If we could understand that for our sons and our daughters there is a tremendous amount of fear because they are afraid of the pain, they are unsure. The way I like to think about this is we have to generate and help create what I call academic confidence. And it's important that we understand you cannot give your son or daughter academic confidence. It must be earned. You can't give your son or daughter the ability to say, I'm going into a new project and I'm going to do well. The only way that happens is for them to go through the process of falling off of the bike, getting back on it, and learning how to ride. And that makes sense for those of us who taught our son or daughter how to, for example, do an athletic sport of some kind or another. I mean, there was a day when they couldn't catch that baseball, and they kept dropping it, and they had to go through the frustration of dropping it and catching it and dropping it and catching it and on until finally they got it. This is what we're looking for in our academic success as well. We have to know that a student is going to suffer defeat and failure. And if we push too much simply success and do not emphasize the importance of failure, we may find our student or our young person withdrawing. They don't want to talk about grades because they got a B instead of an A. If, on the other hand, we focus on learning, the primary question is, what did you learn in math today? The parent then serves, as I have said, as a coach, motivator, a leader. But the question always comes up, what do you do when a son or a daughter is not motivated? See, I believe that academic success for our children involves two components. One, we have to have some motivation there. Two, there has to be some kind of an approach. In Superstar Student, in the first lectures of that video series, I tried to first of all motivate a son or daughter to think about being a good student, and then secondly talk about the importance of a method or approach. Too often we reverse these. We say to students, you should be doing this, 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 and this in a method, without ever realizing no student's ever going to employ a method if they do not, first of all, have some reason or motivation to employ the method. One of the recommendations I would make for you as a parent is that you go back and look at the first few lectures of this tape series, maybe with your son or daughter, and try to analyze specifically the issues of motivation as I talk about them. But for you particularly, I would suggest some of the following. We know, by and large, children become what they see. Now this can be, of course, as is pointed out in the media often, this can be somewhat frightening given all of the stuff that kids watch early on the media. But the reality for us is there's a positive side to this. Students will as well become the positive things that they see. We want to decide that we will be the best examples of academic role models that we can be. This means that we as parents want to demonstrate good learning attitudes. For example, if we want to promote learning and reading in our house because we know that's important, it's important for us maybe to become readers. Designate 30 minutes in the house every evening on school nights when no television is on and everyone reads in the house. I know many families who have employed this method and with remarkable success. When children watch Dad read for 30 minutes every night, Mondays through Friday, there is a remarkable influence it has on older children. I have known families who did this so that their junior in high school would begin to do more reading and homework at night, only to discover that their second and third grader was doing more reading as well, because all of a sudden, all of the older people in the house were reading, and that is significant. In other words, we want to create a climate, a family of learners in our homes. The more people who are participating in the learning, we begin to see it all as a team. Obviously, the other thing here is to talk about important ideas in our family. Use time together as learning experiences. Evening dinner when we're all sitting together, talk about important issues that are happening in the world. Understand that our children are very sophisticated in many, many ways. They are capable of entertaining political questions as things are happening. It's not that we turn off television entirely. We use the medium. Sit together and watch headline news and then talk about it with your sons and your daughters. Well, there is obviously the issues of dealing with children who are just completely unmotivated. What are we going to do with a son or a daughter who says, I've had enough of school and I hate it. I'm not going. There's several suggestions that I would make. First of all, patience. We want to make sure that we have enough patience to allow a young person to act out the way that we know that they're going to act out. I believe too often what happens is that we as parents maybe forget what we were like as kids. And the truth is we weren't often very motivated as well. And the other difficulty for many parents is they were motivated as well. And it's difficult for them to understand, how can it be that my son or daughter is a junior in high school and still is not considering anything about what they will do afterwards? They don't care whether they get a C in class. We have to have some patience. I think the other thing is we have to have some understanding here. That means maybe we have to consider, what are the real problems? Are there some learning disabilities here? I realize too often that maybe this tag phrase is used to allow students to escape from academic responsibility. I work in a public school where obviously that can happen. But I really believe that we have to ask questions. Is there some reason why my son or my daughter is not, in fact, engaging in the classroom? Obviously, we want to ask questions about how my son or daughter is getting along with teachers, with their colleagues and peers in school. And of course, the most important thing is hope. We can't give up. No matter what happens, we refuse to give up. It might be that your son or daughter never learned to ride a bike because they were too afraid of falling and getting back on the bike. And so we just simply said, all right, that's a project we're not going to ask you to learn. But student and academic success is another story entirely. We cannot give up here. We have to support our son or daughter through what is often a very trying experience, the high school years. I think the other thing here that we have to make sure we understand is the importance of goal setting. Because one of the primary ways to help a young person think about their future is to talk with them about goals. What are long-term goals for you? What are short-term goals for you? What is it that we are wanting to see ourselves be, maybe, for example, several years from now? We know that oftentimes our own kids don't think too much about the future, or if they do, they think about it in very sporadic ways. And for example, if they're frightened about their future, they shut down and they don't want to talk about it anymore. Our job is to help them set some long-term goals, but to talk about what will happen in post-high school with support and love. Never as if we're kind of forcing them into a corner. All right, what are you going to do? You need to make up your mind. Instead, to allow our sons or daughters to know, look, honey, we're in this together. I'm helping you think about the future. I want you to think about the future, but I know it's frightening. One of the things I'm going to recommend that you do, and I'll make this recommendation several times in the next two lectures here, is I'm going to recommend that after you finish with this lecture series, you sit down with your son or daughter and say, okay, look, we have some ability to talk now. We can talk about language and learning. So now, what specifically for you are some things that you're afraid of in terms of your academic weaknesses? And what can we do to somehow fix those? The way to get to long-term goals is, of course, short-term goals. And we want to make sure that we are really thinking about how we're going to provide short-term for our son or daughter to get there. Setting up small short-term goals with rewards is one of the most powerful ways I know to set a student on the right course. Let's forget about an A in math for this semester. Honey, let's focus on 3 weeks. Every night, I want to see you together with me sitting down for 10 minutes. And I'll just go over your homework with you. I just want you to teach me your learning journals. See, that's powerful. If you know what learning journals are, you can ask your son or daughter before they leave in the morning for school, to say, show me your learning journals for science real fast, honey. See, your son or daughter will know what that means. What, in other words, the code language here, what are we covering today in science? Where is our master schedule? We can't do learning journals without a master schedule. And this will allow for parents and children to begin to talk together. And these are short-term goals. I think the other thing about motivation here that's of importance is to provide academic role models from outside of the home. As we said above, models are incredibly important. And we want to talk about role models that are positive role models for our kids. In my house, and I have a daughter now in middle school, we have already, from years ago, selected what we call warriors and scholars within our house. Students who exemplify good study, good learning. And we talk about them in our house. What makes them good students? Why are they perceived as good students? Because they emphasize learning over grades. And we point out occasionally, now watch, honey, look how this young person is really doing something in their coursework and really learning, and they're going on to be successful. We want to do a lot of this in our school life, in our home life together. These older students then will set a pattern, hopefully a pattern that our children will begin to emulate as they grow older. Okay, let's talk about some keys to academic success in high school. First of all, I strongly recommend, if you haven't done so, that you take a look at lectures 2 through 10. Because here I speak specifically to students, although it's good for, I think, parents to hear this, to students about what it really means to be a good student. And academic success, if you understand those keys, you can talk to your son or daughter. If they have a major project in writing and they're frustrated, you can say, well, let's sit down and jam write for 10 to 15 minutes. What do you say? I'll time you. See? Or if they feel, they seem a little overwhelmed and they're not getting deadlines met, you can ask them, what about your master schedule? Let's sit down and take a look at your master schedule 2 weeks out for the next 2 weeks with all of your coursework. See, that's code language. And you then and your son or daughter are working together. That's cooperation, and that will lead to success. I think it's important we point out that you can't rely on schools or teachers to educate your son or daughter. To this degree, I believe that all of us have to homeschool. All of us have to be able to work together at home. If you are simply sending your son or daughter off to school and saying, I will allow for the school to educate my son or daughter, you are taking I believe, a great risk. And here, I'm a public school teacher. I am not at all condemning public education, but there's a tremendous amount that has to go on at home. And this is one of the important things that we have to point out. We have to work together at home. A student's education and learning, of course, then is the responsibility of both the parent as well as the student. And school, of course, is the place where we are going to receive primary help so that we can make sure that our children are learning. I want to talk for a few minutes now in more detail about how this learning team concept will lead to academic success. As I've already pointed out, there has to be a team between the parent, the teacher, the student, and we don't want to overlook as well the student's peers. It's the parent's role, as I've already said, to be the academic leader and to help all of these other players participate together. Parents and teachers must work together. Here, of course, as I pointed out in the master schedule lecture, we have to know what's due and we have to know when. I'm often asked, what is really wrong with American schools? What is wrong with American education? And there's a whole bunch in the press, obviously, about this issue. Let me give you my answer to this question. What really I see as wrong with American education is simply ignorance, a large gulf of ignorance between those at home and those at school, and it works both ways. Most parents don't know what happens in classrooms in America. And most teachers at school often don't know what's going on at home. So there's a gap, a gulf of ignorance that works both ways, and this is, I believe, why schools don't do as well as they could. Our project as parents is to bridge the gap between schools and home, to make sure that we understand what's going on in a classroom for our son or our daughter, what's being expected of them, what is due and when. And then, of course, at home, our job is to help promote the important learning which must take place. If kids in America were to be doing their learning journals reading before they came to class so that teachers were actually not introducing a concept but were teaching a concept that had already been seen once, teachers could do so much more powerfully the job they have to do in their classroom. I think as well that we need to point out that the good study approach is the key. It's not enough simply to tell our son or daughter, you need to go into your room, sit down and do homework. We've been maybe saying that for too long. I believe that students will only do what they are shown how to do. And students will only do well what they are shown how to do well. If we want our students to be really successful, we have to introduce them to an approach and then guide them through that approach. If you purchase Superstar Student and you anticipated that we would just throw this in the video and some 10 lectures later our son or daughter is going to wake up the next morning and be this outstanding student, then now is the time for us to have a reality check. There are no gimmicks. Regardless of what the infomercials might suggest, regardless of what books will try to promote in other videos, there really is no quick and fast way to get to that academic success. We have to take it one step at a time, and the approach is the key. My recommendation is to never allow your son or daughter to go to school and enter basic academic coursework without first of all having seen some of the concept before. This will allow for them to be able to hear the concept for the second time. Then when they're doing homework, they're hearing it for the third time. Now obviously that will be a primary way for you to be able to help them learn. I recommended to my students that they utilize you as parents in the exam prep stage. In the exam prep stage for learning journals, that's the third stage, oftentimes I recommend to students that they ask their parents if they can teach the information to their parents. This is a great tool. If you as a parent are really wondering if a young person in your house understands their math or their science or their geography, ask them to teach the primary concepts to you. Say, listen, I'd like for you to tell me what you think will be on the exam for tomorrow. And then they begin to tell you, and then you can say, what exactly is that concept? Explain that one to me. Now, even if you do know, which often is the case, act as if you don't and say, I'd like for you to tell me. Now, of course, if the young person says, "Mike, you already know this already," you can say, "Okay, I know that I know it, but I'm going to pretend like I don't, just so that I can make sure you understand it." Remember, it's not enough that students memorize their notes. This is why learning journals is an approach that works. Students have to take information and then synthesize that information in innovative ways, creative ways. Problem solving oftentimes is a key word here. Critical thinking we oftentimes speak of. What we want students to be able to do is A, know information, B, use information. You as a parent can play a dynamic role in helping remind your son or daughter, honey, it's not enough to simply memorize vocab words. Can you use the vocab in, for example, some sentences? So, lots of parents will take important vocab lists and they will draw words and they will have their special 5 words for the week and they will put them up somewhere. And everybody in the house has to use the words a few times every day. See what we're doing? We're reinforcing the concept that learning takes place all the time over a period of time. We're not going to turn into superstar students in 2-3 weeks. It doesn't work that way. Look, we didn't get to where we are if we're having academic deficiencies. We didn't get to where we are overnight. We're not going to solve our problems overnight. And we as parents especially have to be reminded of this. I remember once a parent came in to me and said, "You know, my son or daughter isn't doing homework." And I said, "Isn't that great? They're acting just like a kid." And they were somewhat stunned by this. I said, "I know very few students who naturally sit down to do their homework. Now, we have our son or daughter acting the way we would expect for them to act a kid. Now it's our job to be the adult and to say, what will it take to motivate my son or daughter to do it? Support, encouragement, love, and never giving up." Finally, I want to comment briefly on a few major issues of concern. I want to point out that the real key for parents is not what your son or daughter does, but more importantly, what your son or daughter is. If we emphasize too much, just simply grades, we may find ourselves believing our son or daughter is an outstanding student, only to discover later, wow, they really weren't the student we would hope that they would be. I think another thing of importance here is that we want to suggest that we can become overly optimistic or involved in the life of our student, and we can miss some of the academic deficiencies or weaknesses. And we want to make sure that we are asking real serious, concrete questions like, "Okay, honey, we know that you are really a powerful athlete, and we know that you're pretty good in math, but I want to talk with you for a while about your weaknesses in reading and in English." We need to make sure, in other words, that our student is well-rounded or complete. And I tried to outline some of that information in some of my earlier lectures. What does it mean to be really well-rounded? I want to say one more time that if you are at all interested in helping your son or daughter in academic success, they've got to become a reader. Now, we understand that students today don't have to read to receive their primary information in their life often, but they have to do academic reading if they're going to get on past high school into their work life and into their university or college life. I will talk more in the next lecture about this, but it's incredibly important that you understand they have to be reading. The more your son or daughter can be reading from the earlier times, the better. Finally, we have to make sure that we want rewards for our students, for our children. We want to help them, and we want to make sure that the rewards will fit the goals. If it's a short-term goal, it can be a small reward, and a long-term goal may be a larger reward. Finally, there are issues that we would call social or peer issues. Sometimes we have to be careful walking a fine line here because we know our son or our daughter is associating with people I called earlier in a crab bucket who's going to try and pull your son or daughter down. Try not to ostracize your son or daughter away from yourself or make too many comments negatively about the people they associate with. Instead, begin to point out other role models for your son or daughter. Begin, of course, with yourself being a good role model. We want our children to succeed and be good students. We want them to be honest and courageous. We must begin, first of all, ourselves being honest and courageous. And sitting down with loving support with our children is the first step towards academic success.